America Looks Abroad. This is the 16th in a series of broadcasts presented by the staff members of the Foreign Policy Association, a nonpartisan organization which offers accurate information on world affairs. Today's subject, the debate over the President's foreign policy. Mr. James Frederick Green, Research Associate of the Foreign Policy Association, is today's speaker. And now, here's Mr. Green.
Today, on the eve of Mr. Roosevelt's third inauguration, the American people are preparing to decide some of the most momentous issues in their history. The 77th Congress is beginning its sessions with one of the great debates of recent decades. During the controversy over the President's Lend-Lease bill, we shall have a chance to reappraise our national interests and to decide our national policy. To make the most of this opportunity and to reach the right decision, it is very important to distinguish between the objectives which the different spokesmen have in mind and the means by which they hope to accomplish those objectives. Some people who agree with Mr. Roosevelt's general foreign policy disagree with this particular bill. Other people who do not accept the President's objectives do desire centralization of authority to speed up defense production. First, a word about the general objectives of foreign policy which dominate the thinking of the administration on the one hand and the opposition on the other. The administration argues that we are witnessing a gigantic struggle for world power between two philosophies of government and two ways of life. President Roosevelt believes that the democracies cannot compromise with dictatorships which resort to aggression. Now, the opponents of Mr. Roosevelt do not accept this thesis in its entirety. Some of them frankly state that they don't care who wins the war. Many others prefer a British victory, but they believe that it is not worth our risking war. They feel that the old world order, which since 1815 has been largely a British world order, is disintegrating, and that nothing we can do will stop the oncoming wave of the future. They suggest that we come to terms with whoever wins the wars in Europe and Asia and reach the best bargain possible. The administration expresses its philosophy in terms of sea power. Secretary Hull, Secretary Stimson, and Secretary Knox, in testifying this week before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, all declared emphatically that American security and independence rest upon control of the high seas, either by ourselves or by friendly powers. They asserted very bluntly that if the British Navy were defeated, we should be in immediate danger of invasion. In other words, they look at the British Navy and the British Empire territories as our own outermost ramparts and our first line of defense. The critics of these cabinet members, like Ambassador Kennedy and Representative Fish, dismissed the possibility of actual invasion as fantastic and argued that we should not be directly threatened if British sea power were destroyed. They argue that Hitler would be far too busy in Europe to risk trouble in the Western Hemisphere, and that he couldn't reach us across the Atlantic, even if he wanted to. Since President Roosevelt and his advisers believe that British sea power is vital to our own safety, they believe that we should make every possible effort to assist those who are resisting the dictatorships. The administration admits that there is risk of war in its policy of aid to Britain, but it declares that there is less risk of war than in any other policy. The administration apparently hopes that our economic support will be enough to prevent a German victory and to assure a British victory. It also believes that if we fail to support Britain now, we shall have to fight later and under very disadvantageous circumstances. Many of those who oppose the administration take a more pessimistic view, assuming that Britain is on the verge of defeat, and hence they argue that it would be fatal for us to commit ourselves now and to back a lost cause. Many others, like Senator Wheeler, for example, feel that Germany cannot be defeated by mere economic aid, but only by a long conflict involving a large American expeditionary force. Over the whole debate, in fact, hangs the shadow of that fear of sending troops abroad again. And of course no one can guarantee that our present commitment of seeing the British through will not eventually require the use of manpower overseas. But that risk is also involved in the alternative policy of not supporting Britain. Thus we Americans are finally coming to grips with the one question which we have been dodging ever since the war began. Are we so convinced that a British defeat would be disastrous to our own national interests that we are willing to prevent that defeat at all cost, even at the risk of going to war? The middle course, which we have followed so far, of helping the British short of war, becomes more difficult every month, although Mr. Kennedy maintained yesterday that it is still possible. The real showdown may come within the next 2 or 3 months. We may soon be caught between two alternatives, neither of which is very pleasant. Either we commit ourselves to preventing Britain's defeat this spring at whatever cost to ourselves, or we tell the British that we are not willing to see them through. The first alternative involves obvious risk of war, as I've already mentioned. It might provoke an immediate showdown with Japan, which is obliged under its alliance with Germany and Italy of last September to come to their rescue. We should then be placed in the unfortunate position of having to fight in the Atlantic and Pacific at the same time. But the second alternative, of promoting peace negotiations now, involves one or two other risks that are sometimes overlooked. If we decline to increase our support, and thus persuaded Britain to start peace negotiations, we would remove the major stimulus to our own defense program and reduce the present pressure for greater production of armaments. The letdown in this country which would follow such an armistice in Europe might give the Axis powers just the breathing spell they needed for complete victory, and leave us even more dangerously exposed to attack. Moreover, by letting the British Empire down now, we would be losing about the only friend we have left among the great powers. The British would probably regard us with the same bitter hostility with which they are now regarded by France. All of these considerations, and probably many more, affect the debate over House Resolution 1776. The bill itself contains a number of controversial issues. Many congressmen who endorse the President's aims hesitate to give so much power to any one man. They regret that the President did not consult the Republican leaders of Congress before introducing the bill, and that he made the measure so wide in scope and so drastic in tone. Many Washington correspondents say that the administration deliberately asked for more than it expected to get, a customary procedure in such negotiations. It's generally believed that the bill will be passed, but with a number of amendments and compromises. Congress as a whole recognizes the need for decisive action in an emergency, but it is not yet prepared to surrender all authority without any time limitations and without periodical accounting. Probably the proposal which Mr. Wilkie and others have made regarding a definite time limit for these powers, perhaps 2 years, would eliminate many doubts and hesitations. Several things must be said on behalf of the bill. By putting everything into one brief measure, the administration is determined to settle the general policy of aid to Britain once and for all. Piecemeal proposals introduced month after month would only have increased the bitterness of debate and confused and alarmed the public. Secondly, the bill in itself is only an outline of power, only an outline of action, a grant of power. To have any effect, good or bad, it must be implemented by specific actions and regulations, and especially by actual increase in industrial output. Such a grant of authority, its proponents argue, including Mr. Wilkie, is a necessary weapon for the government to have in a great emergency, both for foreign policy and domestic affairs. And finally, it can be argued that the bill itself does not afford the executive much new opportunity to involve the country in war. Every president, as commander-in-chief of our armed forces, has the right to get the country into war, for he has the constitutional authority to move airships, troops, and vessels anywhere he wants. Theoretically, the President could, without this bill, order the fleet to convoy merchant vessels or to participate in hostilities abroad. As we discovered last fall, the President on his own authority can trade destroyers for naval bases or release army weapons to a belligerent power. The opponents of the Lend-Lease Bill declare, however, that the measure sweeps aside all restrictions on executive powers and in effect takes away from Congress the power to declare war. Some of them say that it would have been much more honest for the administration to ask Congress for a declaration of war. They point out that while the President has very great powers as Commander-in-Chief, he is given some new and rather startling ones by this measure. One obvious change lies in the clause under which the President can allow belligerent powers to repair their naval vessels in this country, a reversal of our previous neutrality statutes and of international law. It's quite possible that this particular provision might be put into effect immediately, as British shipyards and repair docks are said to have been seriously damaged by air raids. The opponents of the bill also want to know the exact status of the Neutrality Act and the Johnson Act, since the new resolution specifically gives these powers to the President, notwithstanding the provisions of any other law. A number of critics, including such prominent citizens as former President Hoover, Mr. Landon, and Mr. Dewey, warn that the Lend-Lease Bill is a prelude to dictatorship. They fear, as many Americans fear, that war, or even this all-out aid to Britain, means the end of democracy in America. On the other hand, some people, like Senator Glass, feel that even the Lend-Lease Bill does not go far enough, and that only a declaration of war will suffice to turn the tide in Europe. British spokesmen, both official and unofficial, have been very careful in the past to avoid asking us to enter the war. Prime Minister Churchill Friday night declared he did not need our manpower, but he begged us for an avalanche of weapons. Our declaration of war would, of course, have certain obvious advantages to the British. It would allow American merchant vessels to carry supplies to the British Isles and American warships to convoy them. It would allow American warships and planes to enter the Mediterranean, where the German Air Force is striking fiercely at the British Navy. Furthermore, our entering the war would, of course, greatly speed up our production of arms and munitions, and it might also have an important effect upon the morale of the German and Italian people, who still hope for victory in the near future. Whatever our decision on the Lend-Lease Bill and on these vital questions of policy, one or two other issues will deserve our attention in the future. One of them has to do with war aims. Many of the people who hesitate to hand the President a blank check are asking what kind of a world he has in mind at the end of hostilities, should Britain, with American aid, obtain a victory over Germany. Now, it would be difficult for the American government to request a public statement of British war aims at a time when Britain is fighting for survival. But at least we ought to be formulating our own aims, as we did so effectively in the World War. This question of war aims becomes especially difficult when we realize that the British are undergoing severe economic strain and social transformation. No one can predict what kind of society and what form of government will emerge in Britain, even in case of victory. Many American businessmen dislike the idea of underwriting a British government which contains the leading figures of the Labor Party, just as many American liberals and labor spokesmen distrust the conservatives in the British government. Well, out of all this confusion and disagreement, can we possibly evolve any clear and consistent policy? There is certainly no easy way for a democracy to formulate a foreign policy. Perhaps, however, we can learn a few lessons from Britain and France and the other countries which in the past few years have been through just such crises and have had to make just such difficult decisions. One of the lessons of the last year or two is always to expect the worst and to prepare for the worst. The fatal mistake of Britain and France was to underestimate the strength of the dictatorships and to overestimate their own strength. A second lesson is the need for speed, whatever policy is followed, in order to avoid that tragic phrase, too little and too late. Another lesson of Europe is this: it is worthless to build armaments unless the people of the country have faith in their political institutions and confidence in their leaders, and unless they are convinced that the heavy economic burdens of defense are being shared by all citizens and all classes. Thus, with the experience of Britain, France, the smaller countries of Western Europe, and the various British democracies before us, we should be able to learn a great deal about what to do and what not to do in starting our own defense preparations.
Mr. James Frederick Green, Research Associate of the Foreign Policy Association, was today's speaker in the America Looks Abroad series. If you would like to have a free copy of this talk, address your request to the Foreign Policy Association, 22 East 38th Street, New York, or in care of the station to which you are listening. I will repeat the address. That's Foreign Policy Association, 22 East 38th Street, New York, or in care of the station to which you are listening. The Foreign Policy Association is a nonpartisan organization open to all who are interested in American foreign policy. It offers accurate information on current world happenings. In the world of today, foreign affairs are your affairs. We invite you to tune in next Sunday to hear another speaker in the America Looks Abroad series. This is the National Broadcasting Company.